It seems like Alzheimer's is just everywhere these days.
Yeah, it's true.
It feels like everyone's got a story, whether it's a grandparent or someone they've read about,
Right.
and it just keeps getting more and more common.
It's a big deal, and
Yeah.
it's one of the reasons why this research that you sent over is
Mhm.
really exciting, because it could really change how we're able to detect it
Yeah.
early on.
Early detection is key, right?
Yeah,
If you could catch it early enough to actually make a difference,
absolutely.
that would be huge.
This study looks at, well, proteins, basically,
Well,
and how they change in the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF.
okay, so let's back up for a sec for those who haven't listened to every episode.
Sure.
Cerebrospinal fluid. What is that? So that's like the brain is,
It's the brain's bath, essentially.
it's like fluid.
Yeah, it's this fluid that surrounds your brain and your spinal cord.
Right. Keeps things running smoothly, keeps things clean.
Exactly.
And so what they're looking at is they're looking at that fluid as kind of like a window into what's going on.
Yeah, like a little sample that
Yeah.
can tell us
Into the brain.
what's happening in there.
Instead of trying to like get in there, which is a lot harder
Right.
to look
It's
at.
much easier to look at this fluid.
So they're analyzing the proteins in that fluid.
Yeah, and they're looking at something called the proteome, which is just a fancy word for all the proteins
Right.
that are in a sample at a given time.
Like a fingerprint.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
It tells us what's happening inside the cells.
So this wasn't just any old protein analysis. This was some seriously high-tech stuff.
Oh, yeah. They used mass spectrometry, which is a very precise and powerful technique that lets scientists measure thousands of proteins at the same time.
That is a lot of proteins.
It is a lot of data.
Wow. And not only that, just to make it even more like ironclad in terms of the results,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't just look at one group of people. They had 3 different groups, right?
3 different groups of people, yeah.
All a mix of people who had Alzheimer's and people who didn't.
That's correct, yeah. And we call those cohorts in research.
Okay.
And it's really important to make sure that what you're seeing
Right.
isn't just a fluke or
Yeah.
something that's specific to just one particular group.
Right.
And these groups were from different places, too.
Okay.
One was in Sweden, and then 2 were in Germany.
So having those different groups, those cohorts, it's like getting a second opinion and a third opinion.
Yes.
To make sure that what you're seeing is legit
Exactly.
and not just some random thing.
And what's really cool is one of these groups, one of these cohorts, was people who were in the very early stages of Alzheimer's.
Oh, wow.
Some of them, even before they had any kind of memory problems that were really noticeable.
So you're talking like really early detection.
Super early.
Wow. So they were seeing changes in these proteins even before any symptoms.
Exactly.
That's wild. Okay.
That's what makes this so exciting.
So we've got our super sleuthing protein analysis. We've got our different groups of people. But what did they find? Like, what's the beef?
Well, the protein tau, as you might expect, played a big role.
Okay, so tau, that's a protein that we've heard about before in Alzheimer's research.
Yeah, it's one of those proteins that's involved in the structure of brain cells. It's kind of like a scaffolding protein.
Right.
And in Alzheimer's, that tau gets all tangled
Yeah.
up. It forms these clumps, and that's one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease.
So it's not a huge shock to find that in the Alzheimer's group, that tau was kind of messed up.
Not really.
What else did they see?
So tau wasn't alone.
Okay.
There are a whole bunch of other proteins that were also acting differently in the Alzheimer's groups.
So it wasn't just one bad apple. It was like the whole fruit basket was a little funky.
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay, so what does that tell us then?
Well, it suggests that, Alzheimer's isn't just about this one protein, tau, going haywire. It might be more like a whole system breakdown, right?
Yep.
A whole network of proteins that are out of whack.
Interesting.
And this really challenges the traditional view of Alzheimer's,
Right, it's not just this one thing you can pinpoint.
Exactly.
It's like a cascade of things happening.
It's much more complex than we thought.
So instead of just looking at this one tree, now we're looking at the whole forest
That's a good way to put it.
and seeing how everything's interconnected.
Exactly. And across all 3 of those groups, remember those 3 different cohorts we talked about?
Right.
They found 40 proteins that were consistently different in the Alzheimer's patients.
40 proteins, that's a lot.
That's a lot, right?
That's like a fingerprint.
Yeah, you could think of it as like a protein signature
Oh, wow.
for Alzheimer's.
Okay, that's detectable through the spinal tap.
Through a spinal tap, yeah.
So instead of just having 1 or 2 clues, you've got 40,
Exactly.
which is way more reliable, it seems like, for
Yeah.
early detection.
Yeah, and the fact that they found these 40 proteins across 3 different groups
Right.
with different backgrounds, different lifestyles, it just makes the findings that much stronger.
Right.
Because a lot of times in research, you see something in one group and then you try to replicate it.
Right, it doesn't always work out.
It doesn't work, and so this is really promising.
Yeah, this feels like a potential game changer.
I think so.
To be able to, like, I don't know, in the future, just get a spinal tap and there with a high degree of certainty, like,
Yeah.
okay, you're on the path to Alzheimer's or you're
Yeah.
not. I mean, what power would that give people in terms of planning for the future or even looking into treatments? Even if they're not there yet, at least you'd know.
Exactly. And that's, why early diagnosis is everything,
Right.
because it's not just about knowing what's coming. It's about giving people hope and empowering them.
Right, and giving them options.
And giving them options, yeah, to make decisions about their health and their future.
This is really cool stuff.
Yeah.
But let's put on our, like, science hats for a second here and dig into
Okay.
what these 40 proteins are actually doing. Like,
Yeah.
what's their job in the brain?
So it turns out a lot of them are involved in how brain cells, neurons, communicate with each other.
Okay.
And that makes sense, right? Because Alzheimer's affects memory, it affects thinking, and that's all about the connections
Yeah.
between those neurons in the brain.
So if the communications break,
Well, that's-
you're going to see that in these proteins.
Exactly.
How else?
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The study also found a link between these proteins and energy production
Well,
in the brain,
interesting. Okay.
especially a process called glycolysis.
Glycolysis. Now, there's a word I haven't heard in a while.
Right. It's back to like high school biology.
Yeah, exactly. So for those who, like me, haven't thought about that in a while, glycolysis, that's how cells make fuel, right?
Exactly.
Like their little power plant.
Like the cell's little power plant.
Okay, got it.
It's how they take glucose, basically sugar, and turn it into energy that they can use.
Okay.
So it's essential for keeping everything working.
So we've got some proteins involved in communication. We've got some proteins involved in energy. How does that all tie back to Alzheimer's, though? What's the connection?
So that's the million-dollar question, right? And what this study suggests is that energy production in the brain could be really messed up in Alzheimer's.
Okay.
Because a lot of these proteins that were different in the Alzheimer's group are involved in glycolysis.
So it's not just about these, like, misfolded proteins, these plaques and tangles we hear about.
Yeah.
It's also that the brain just isn't getting the energy it needs
Exactly.
to function properly.
Exactly. And that's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, that's huge.
Because it challenges our traditional view of what's going on in Alzheimer's disease.
It's like realizing your car's not working because it's out of gas,
Exactly.
not just because there's something wrong with the engine.
I love that analogy. That's a great analogy.
And just like if you realize it's a fuel problem,
Right.
that gives you a place to target
Exactly.
for treatment, for intervention.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what's so exciting about this, is that it opens up all these new avenues.
New evidence for treatment. Yeah.
So if you had to pick one thing, what would you want our listener to walk away with today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that this research offers hope,
Okay.
because this 40 protein signature, it could really change how we diagnose Alzheimer's, how we treat it.
Right.
And it opens the door for intervening earlier, maybe even finding a cure someday.
It's like, imagine being able to get a spinal tap
Yeah.
and with a high degree of certainty
Right.
what's going on, and then being able to plan for the future or even begin treatment right away. That would be incredible. And then, going off of that, I was thinking, if these 40 proteins can tell us whether someone has Alzheimer's,
Yeah.
could they also tell us how well treatments are working?
That's a great question.
Something to ponder.
Yeah, this is really just the beginning.
Yeah, so much more to learn.
So much more to explore.
Well, this has been a fascinating dive. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure being here. Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing.